Introducing our guest tonight is Mr. David Ness, who is known to many of you. He's a career Foreign Service officer, now retired, our Deputy Ambassador to Cairo a number of years ago, and who by coincidence served on Averell Harriman's staff as political advisor at the same time when General Walters was serving as his military advisor. So I think it's entirely appropriate that Mr. Ness make an introduction this evening. Mr. Ness.
Frank, thank you very much. I really am so pleased to have this chance to introduce to you this evening the legendary Vernon Walters. Approaching almost a half century of distinguished government service, both military and political. Were I to give this long career justice, I think that Ambassador Walters would be back in New York before I finish. However, just a few highlights which interest me and I hope will interest you. Educated largely in Europe in his younger years and teens, he became an accomplished linguist, bilingual in all Romance languages, plus German, plus later on Dutch and Russian. Amazing as it may seem to view him now as a three-star general, retired, he enlisted in the Army as a private prior to Pearl Harbor, convinced that we would be in the war very shortly. In due course, he gained admittance to the OCS infantry school at Denny, despite lacking a high school diploma. Graduating as a young second lieutenant, he joined the 9th Infantry Division Intelligence Unit and was in on the assault landings in North Africa, specifically in Safi. He proceeded from there to make contact with a number of senior French officers, successfully persuading them to cease their concentration of American forces. Called by General Mark Clark to become his aide, he was then on the landings in Italy and the entry and liberation of Rome. So much for World War II, except to say that in the course of this, he met and became very close to General de Gaulle, knowing him throughout his lifetime, and probably the one American that the general trusted most. Following the war, he, as Frank has mentioned, was assigned to Ambassador Harriman's staff at the Marshall Plan headquarters in Paris. At the same time, I was assigned as assistant political advisor. And on arrival, I was introduced to this tall, very slim young major, Dick Walters. From the Marshall Plan, Vernon Walters went back to the White House, accompanied President Truman on that famous visit and confrontation with General MacArthur on Wake Island. Really an incredible beginning to a long career. When General Eisenhower, who had already known Vernon Walters, requested him to come over to Shape as one of his assistants, he did so, accompanying the general throughout the NATO area as we were developing the alliance. But Ambassador Harriman still had his eye on him, picked him up and took him with him to that famous meeting and negotiation with Mossadegh in Persia, and thereafter with Tito with Yugoslavia, when we were able to recognize our relationship with that first communist country. When Ike became president, it was quite natural that he called Vernon Walters back to the White House, and from there he accompanied the president on innumerable trips abroad, including 2 summits with Khrushchev, the latter being the one where Khrushchev aborted the conference as a result of the U-2 incident. He also accompanied Vice President Nixon on his famous tour throughout South America, which I gather resulted in some rather hairy incidents in one or two of the capitals, wherein actually the Vice President showed tremendous courage in walking out unescorted, unattended, into a mob of demonstrating students. An incredible story. Finally, Vernon Walters was appointed as a general to become military attaché in Paris, a very senior military position because it was at the center of our problems with de Gaulle as far as NATO is concerned. But having arrived there with all of the responsibilities this assumed, he was picked up by Henry Kissinger and participated in the very highly secret and sensitive talks with the North Vietnamese and with the Chinese, leading eventually to the Paris Accords on Vietnam and to President Nixon's visit to Beijing. These talks, it's interesting in the context of what's been going on recently, were conducted in such secrecy and were so sensitive that they were managed entirely by the White House and the National Security Council without any participation by state defense or the CIA. And of course they were successful. Finally appointed to the CIA as deputy director, Vernon Walters was very quickly confirmed by the Senate, and within a week or two he was called to the White House by John Dean and was approached, not too subtly, with the request that the CIA participate in the Watergate cover-up. As I hear it, General Walters at that time told him to go stuff. And I have an idea if you ask him any questions about Iran-Gate now, he may have the same response. In 1976, he retired with 3 stars, having risen in private, and he retired from the CIA, spent a year or 2 languishing and writing a book, which I certainly would commend to you, Solid Missions, which covers all of this in great detail, until he was finally called back by President Reagan to become ambassador at large and a troubleshooter. In this position, if you can believe it, he visited 108 countries in a matter of several years, before, of course, being appointed as ambassador to the UN, the most senior ambassadorial position we have in the world, and it entitles the holder to a position on the cabinet. I think that was done by Henry Lodge. So here we have a linguist extraordinary, a consummate diplomat, an intelligent professional in the best sense of the word, and an international man. With his close friends, he is also one of the most amusing, eloquent, and candid raconteurs of the history of the post-war period I've ever run into. And so, without further ado, and I hope he's still here, I give you Ambassador Vernon Walters.
The most terrifying biographical memory I have ever heard in my life. I'm sure glad he's on our side. That is truly a prodigious feat, David. Absolutely astonishing to go through that. I don't know whether I could have done it that well myself, and it happened to me. But you can see why he rose high in our country's diplomacy now. Because a good memory is a very useful tool in diplomacy. Before I go any further, I would like to apologize to you. I have a feeling that I have postponed or changed my date for coming to see you at least on 2 occasions. On the last one, I had a fairly plausible one. I had to go to Europe on the Libyan matter. And that was an overriding thing. I had no flexibility, whatever. I was given an airplane and told, go, now. So I went now. I am very honored that you have come here tonight, and I want to say a few words about the various, as you heard David's biography, the various kinds of representing America at various places and at various times. One of my early representatives of America was after that assault landing in North Africa, when I was a second lieutenant. And we landed at Safi, and we started up the coast to Casablanca, which was still holding out and resisting. The French were resisting our landing. And we got to a bridge over a river at a place called Azamor. And we stopped there, and we found that the French battalion that had been in the town on the south side of the river had moved to the north bank and is prepared to defend the river crossing. And I was working then for the General Ernest Herman. General Ernest Herman later became the president of Norwich University, which was the least likely future I would have predicted for him. He was the sort of man who made George Patton seem shy. I remember two wonderful stories about him. He came into a staff meeting a little later in Tunisia, and he was having a briefing, and he wrapped the map with a riding crop, and he said, I'd give 1,000 men to take that hill. And from the back of the room where the second lieutenants were, came a voice saying, generous son of a bitch, isn't he? And anyway, he called me in and he said, Walters, I want you to go up there and tell those damn Frenchmen we don't want to fight them. The Germans are landing in Tunisia. We want to go up there and drive them out of North Africa. And he said, you take my half-track and you go up there and stand up in the half-track so they'll see you're coming on a friendly mission. So I remember there was a signal corps photographer and he said, can I go with you? He was a first lieutenant, and I said, certainly, get in. And I saluted as he got in. And in those days, second lieutenants didn't salute first lieutenants. He said, why are you saluting me? I said, you're going on this mission as a volunteer. I have no choice. So we drove up through this little town, and we drove up to the bridge, and I could see the chamber, the explosives where they'd been set in the bridge, and the wires leading back from the other side. And I had a long, actually it probably lasted 30 seconds, meditation which said, if you cross the bridge, you will be blown up and you will be dead, but you will be honored dead. If you don't cross the bridge, you will be shot for cowardice and you will be dishonored as well as dead, and that seemed less preferable. So I turned to the young driver of the half-track, and I didn't trust my voice. I waved. And he said, Lieutenant, are you serious? So we drove across the bridge, and as you can see, they didn't blow it. When I got to the other side, two Frenchmen jumped up with submachine guns and told me I was a prisoner. But I was so relieved at getting across that bridge. This didn't seem like much. So I said, get in here and take me at once to Colonel Signoc. We knew the name of the colonel, he was intelligent. So we went up and they took me to his command post, and I was brought in to see him, and he was sitting there scowling and looking very bleak, and he said, what do you want? And I said, Colonel, I have come in the name of the old friendship that has united our two countries since the dawn of our independence. He said, I don't want any Lafayette sauce. What is it you want? So I said, Colonel, we want you to take your battalion back and reoccupy your garrison while we go to Tunisia and throw the Germans out. He said, don't you know I have orders? I said, Colonel, if you had orders to spit on the French flag, would you do it? I said, you know, I've lived in your country for 10 years, and you can't live 10 years in a country without feeling something for it. And today, when I think Germans are kicking Frenchmen off the sidewalks in Paris, I can't stand it. He said, my God, I'm a Frenchman, neither can I. So he agreed not to fight. So I put him in the half-track and took him back to my general, who immediately elevated me to first lieutenant. It was very profitable. Up the road, a colonel tried this, and he got killed and got a Congressional Medal of Honor, but he was dead. And I was lucky and I wasn't. That was my first representation of the United States in any sort of foreign forum of any sort. Later on, I had a more interesting type of representation of the United States. General Clark sent me to the Brazilian division in Italy to be his personal liaison officer with that division. The Brazilians had 30,000 men in Italy, which a lot of people don't know, an infantry division plus. And there again, I got a new lesson in diplomacy, if you will. They had just gone into line. We put them in a very quiet part of the front where nothing bad would happen to them. And so the Corps Commander, General Kritzberger, came up and he said, I'd like you to take Mount Castello, could you do it? The proceeding judge said, of course. So General Frittenberg said, what do you mean? He said, nothing. Oh. These groups had never been really involved in any fighting. So as I walked General Frittenberg out to his jeep, he said, gee, I wish my American division commanders were like that. When I went back to the Brazilian general, he said, Walters, you have to get us out of this. I said, General, how can I get you out of it? You just told the Corps commander that you could do it. He said, yeah, but you can't say no to the Corps commander. I said, no, but you can say I need artillery, I need airplanes, I need engineers, I need tanks, I need tank destroyers. And he looked at me and he said, Walters, if you're going to work with us, you're going to have to learn quite quickly the difference between yes, which means yes, and yes, which means no. So that was a further education in representing the United States and how far does react as compared to the way we react. After that, I went back to Brazil, where I was the assistant military attaché for a while. And then I went up to Bogota, where I was General Marshal's aide. It is a curious freak of history that the United States has had 5 five-star generals. And at one time or another, I've been aide to 3 of them. General Marshall, General Eisenhower, and General Bradley. And General Marshall was then Secretary of State, and this was really my first opportunity to work closely with people from the State Department, with whom I was destined to spend a good deal of time in the rest of my life. And during this, there was a very bloody revolution in Bogota. The leader of the opposition was assassinated, the opposition party rose against the government. And there was a lot of back, going to and fro, and I went with Mr. Harriman, and Mr. Harriman had accepted an invitation to lunch with the president. But by this time, they were shooting all over the city. It was a Sunday morning, and I decided I had to go to church. And I went down with Cecil Lyon, who was a very distinguished Foreign Service officer, and really the sort of person people think of when they think of a striped pants diplomat. He looked every inch of it, but inside beat a heart of steel. We drove down to the church, and we found the cathedral closed. And in South America, when the cathedral is closed on Sunday, you begin to get an uneasy feeling. So I was very upset by this, and Cecil said to the driver, Anibal, go into the next square, there's another church there. So we went into this square, it was a big tree-filled square, and the soldiers had stacked their rifles. And just as we drove in, snipers in the buildings began shooting at the soldiers. I was considerably perturbed by this. Cecil seemed not to have even heard this. The driver put his hand on the horn and his foot on the accelerator and took off. Cecil said, Anibal, stop the car. I said, Cecil, do you think this is wise? He said, yes, people are much more inclined to shoot at moving cars than parked ones. So I examined the texture of the floor mat, and his shoes and my shoes, and as I peeked up, the square was pretty empty by this time. The soldiers all had their rifles and were shooting at the buildings. And I said, Cecil, don't you think it's time to go to church? He said, yes, Anibal, drive to the church. So we drove over to the church, fusillade going on behind us. Cecil descended from the car with all the aplomb of an ambassador presenting his credentials, started up the steps of the church without a backward glance. And he paused and he didn't look around to this vulgar brawl that was going on. He said to the driver in Spanish, Anibal will be in here for about an hour. You can come back then. Oh no, senor, said Anibal, the driver. Today, I too am going to church. So I got a little lesson in the necessity of showing guts when you're also carrying out diplomacy. And I gave him my first view of the fact that strike plants could well hide a heart of steel. And Cecil had one, and he's alive and well, and living in Dartmouth today. After that, I went to, General Marshall kept me with him for a while, and then I went to Europe to set up the NATO headquarters. And I worked there with him. And this was a very vital and key part of my life. I regard the NATO alliance as the last relic of the bipartisan foreign policy of the United States. It was reached by common consent of both parties, and it endures to this day by common consent of both parties. And people often say that it's outdated or it should be changed. I would simply point out that this is the longest lasting alliance in human history, with the single exception of the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1383, which the British invoked during the war to get bases in the Azores from the Portuguese. During the time this alliance has been in existence, it has not lost a single square inch of territory. Not a single citizen has passed under communist rule. And the dissolution of this alliance remains one of the prime objectives of Soviet foreign policy. And I think that is as great a proof of success as you can have. Behind the shield of confidence provided by this alliance, Europe, whose gross national product, when Mr. Harriman came there to set up the Marshall Plan, was 6% that of the United States, is today as large as ours. But it could not have done that without the confidence provided by the shield of protection which the Atlantic Alliance gave it, just as Japan arose in the same way behind the shield of the Japanese-American alliance, which gave them the belief that they would have a future. One of the more moving experiences of my life at that time was to go to Essen with Mr. Harriman. Essen was a desert of houses beyond description. It was a city of 1 million people that had been totally and completely leveled. It was the seat of the Krupp Steel Works, one of the main instruments of German war industry. And I went down with Mr. Harriman to visit a German family in the basement. We came out, and I came up and looked at this miles of destruction. And I said, Mr. Harriman, I wonder if I live to be a very old man, will I ever see a German city rebuilt? And he said, of course you will, and very soon. I said, Mr. Harriman, how can you say that? Look at this. He said, did you see what those people had on the table downstairs in the basement? There was no house, they were living in the basement. I said, yes, they had a bowl of flowers. He said, any people who puts flowers on the table in the midst of this desolation will rebuild the cities. And as you know, they did. Those were the days when in a bakery in Holland, you would see a sign which said, 1/2 your daily bread is baked with Marshall help. But of course, today we have a generation that has very little or no memory of that. A generation which has regained confidence in itself, which doesn't remember what occupation is like. But in the crunches, that old feeling comes back. The Europeans, who felt greatly threatened by the overwhelming Soviet conventional superiority, asked us to emplace missiles that would be dedicated to the defense of Europe, not strategic missiles aimed at the Soviet Union, but missiles that would be aimed at the threatening Soviet conventional forces in Eastern Europe. We agreed to do that. When we did, at our expense, when we did, then there was a great outcry against the emplacement of these missiles. The Russians said if one missile was deployed, there would be no further negotiations. This produced great tumult in Western Europe. There were huge demonstrations against the sighting of these missiles. The Soviets already had 400 of these missiles in place, theater missiles. In 2 countries, the election was fought in large part on this issue, in Great Britain and in Germany. And in both cases, the party favorable to deploying the missiles won the election. Now the Europeans are concerned because they're afraid we're going to take the missiles out. They asked us to put them in. They demonstrated against our putting them in, and now they're worried about them taking it out. One of our problems in Europe is that we have a very narrow margin of maneuver. If we show any degree of cordiality or receptiveness to the Russians, they say, my God, they're going to make a deal over our heads and leave. If, on the other hand, we show any firmness, they say, my God, those crazy cowboys are going to set off World War III. So this doesn't leave us much room for maneuver. Also, they have a rather patronizing attitude. You know, that you Americans are rather naive and ingenuous. You don't have the kind of long historical perspective we have stretching back to Charlemagne. I said, all that may be true, but in the years between the wars, when we had very little to do with running the world, like between 1918 and 1939, you wiser, older powers with great historical perspective got yourself 21 years of peace. Since we naive, ingenuous, stumble-bomb Americans without perspective have had some part in running the world, you've had 42 years of peace, the longest period Europe has known since Waterloo. We cannot let Europe go. There's no way we can let Europe go. It's the largest pool of trained manpower in the world. It's the largest industrial infrastructure in the world. And if it would pass intact into the hands of the Soviets, it would totally overturn the balance of power in the world. So we really do not have any choice, and our pledge word is there. We've kept 365,000 men in Europe for nearly 45 years, which is an enormous period of time and a cost of over $100 billion a year to the American taxpayer. I was in London recently, and they were all worked up over the Iran gate and saying, how can we, your government is in complete disarray. How can we count on you for a serious commitment? Well, I said, first let me tell you that I'm getting my instructions daily, and they're not in any state of disarray. And secondly, if 365,000 men for 40 years is not a lasting commitment, I don't know what is. But you see, the British are like us. The only places in the United Nations today where I get great cries of moral outrage over Irangate is from the British, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians. Everybody else who was trading with the Iranians and the Iraqis, who was negotiating with terrorists and everybody else, their main concern, as one of them put it to me, is that you Americans do not once again whip yourself into a penitential frenzy where you're incapable of carrying out your role as the leaders of the free world. I just worry that we're a little bit like the Russians during the Great Purge. If you confessed to your sins, you were spared. If you said, no, I didn't do it, you were condemned to death. We want to, General de Gaulle, I think, summed it up very well. He said, the Puritanism of the Americans doesn't prevent them from sinning. It simply prevents them from enjoying their sins. And I'm afraid there's a considerable amount of truth in it. Then, as Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, obviously I had a lot to do with friendly foreign services, which are very important to us. And there I had a strong sense, you know, these languages of mine which are referred to, and which are regarded in the United States as some sort of weird achievement, you know, like being able to stand on your head or something, in Europe will simply entitle you to apply for a post as a concierge in a great hotel, provided you know the town quite well. One of my friends, unquote, once said, Wallace is a guy who speaks 8 languages and thinks in none. Well, you have to live with those things, you know, in life. So, as a matter of fact, when this negotiation with the Chinese began, it began in Paris, where I was a military attaché. One day, I was called back to Washington by the Defense Department. When I got back, I said, who wants to see me? And they said, the President wants to see you. I said, he does? What have I done? It was Mr. Nixon, whom I had lived through various adventures with. And I went over there, and he said, do you recognize me as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces? I said, Mr. President, the Constitution is explicit. Yes. He said, fine. I want you to take this letter, and I want you to deliver it to the Chinese ambassador in Paris. And he said, I want you to begin negotiating with the Chinese the normalization of relations with them. At that time, my instructions were, do not shake hands with the Chinese, do not acknowledge their presence, do not have anything to do with them. That was the President's policy. Mr. Nixon changed it. When Mr. Reagan changed it, apparently it's a great crime. And it was for much the same reason. China had 1 billion people. We had no contact with it. Iran doesn't have 1 billion, it has 50 million. But it controls some of the most strategic real estate in the world, and we had no contact with it. However, in the case of China, there was someone ready to talk to us. In the case of Iran, we were misled. There was no one ready to talk to us. It may have been a mistake, but in my view, it was not a crime. So we began to negotiate with the Chinese. They were very explicit. Any publicity and we break off the negotiation. When the CIA station chief in Paris found out I'd been doing this for 1.5 years, I had just been appointed Deputy Director of CIA, he said, I can't believe that you could do this without my knowing it. All along, I just thought you were a good linguist. I said, Dave, that's an honest statement, but not a terribly tactful one to the guy who's about to become your boss. So we began, and after they talked to me for a while, they wanted to talk to Kissinger, which was what Kissinger was hoping for. So when he came and met them for the first time as we were leaving, he said to me, when they see you, do they receive you exactly the way they receive me? And I said, no. He said, what's the difference? I said, when I go, I'm met at the outer gate by a junior Chinese. He takes me to the building where I'm met by a middle-level Chinese. He takes me into what I call the Fu Manchu room because it's all red silk with lanterns and tassels and very Chinese-looking. And 90 seconds later, the ambassador comes in and says, ni hao, and I say ni hao, and we begin to talk. He said, what's different with me? I said, at the outer gate, you were met by the lower level and middle level Chinese. When you got to the front door of the building, you were met by the ambassador. And when you got into the Fu Manchu room, you got both incense and background music, neither of which I ever get. And I saw a quiet smile of satisfaction spread across his face, that even in a classless society like China, there was some recognition of the difference between his position and mine. After that, I got appointed Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, where in addition to telling John Dean that I would not use CIA secret funds to pay the Watergate burglars, I had a lot to do with foreign friendly services who were very disturbed by all the investigations in our country, and many of whom had withdrawn from cooperating with us. And we had to reassure them that we might tell our own secrets, but we wouldn't tell theirs. And that was a very difficult time. Now, I've always had a belief that I owe it to the United States to train people to do what I do when I can no longer do it. One of the things, I had a private dining room there. And of course, my long years in France told it was the best eating place in Washington, D.C., bar none. And when they would say, oh, we've got the head of the Japanese intelligence service, I said, fine, there are 12 seats. You can have 9 to the people that dealt with them. And they said, what do you want the other 3 for? One is for you. Who are the other 2 for? I said, for young officers in your service who would not be at that table for 10 years, normally, by rank or by experience. I want them to watch how we deal with one another. When I was a young officer as an interpreter, I would sit in on meetings that I had no business sitting in on. And it enabled me to watch these older and more senior people, how they dealt with them. And it was an enormous help to me as I came to represent the United States on various things. When the time came in my career, instead of saying, tell this man this, you go and tell him this. And that was a watershed, in a sense, when I passed from being a messenger boy to something of negotiating myself and dealing with them myself. That was a very fascinating period in my life, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Even though Americans are very ambivalent about intelligence, when they're not frightened, they think it's un-American, and we shouldn't do it. When they're frightened, they say, why don't we have better intelligence? What's the matter? Who's been sleeping on the watch? But it was a very difficult time retaining the confidence of these friendly countries, because they'd say, what we tell you is going to appear in the congressional record day after tomorrow. And I would try and reassure them. I showed them a letter from George Washington, who was Chief of Intelligence in New Jersey, which said, there is no need for me to insist with you on the importance of keeping these matters secret. For lack of secrecy, such matters, no matter how well planned, generally fail. I am, sir, your obedient servant, George Washington. He understood this. He was a trusting man. One day he intercepted a British letter in code, and he gave it to 2 separate cryptologists to break it to make sure that he had the same answer from both of them. He sent it down to Congress. Well, someone sent it down to Congress. He was very disturbed with this, and he sent a group of cavalry down to recover it. But it's a very difficult thing, because, as I say, we have a very ambivalent attitude about this. And yet, the second Chief Justice of the United States ran a thing called the Committee of Secret Correspondence during the Revolution, which was in effect our intelligence service. And he was once asked to tell the Congress the name of the persons to whom he paid money, the purposes for which paid, and the amounts. And he replied, and believe it or not, he got away with this, the Congress is composed of too many people to keep this kind of secrets. He got away with it. He not only got away with it, he got confirmed as Chief Justice of the United States. Those were different days. You couldn't do that now. Then I came back, and I'm running out of my time, as ambassador at large. Al Haig asked me to come as ambassador, sort of troubleshooting ambassador at large, and I came back. And I used to say that I got the cases where pulse and respiration had ceased, but there were a few brain waves still visible. And those are the ones I would get. I would get all the sort of difficult people of the world who were in a frenzy or in a rage or in something else, and part of my job was to soothe them and try and make them do what we wanted or vote for what we wanted. And that is the incarnation in which I traveled 1.5 million miles in 4 years and visited 108 countries. The count is up to 128 now. I'm only lacking 30 to complete the United Nations. And I'm arranging my trip, so I do that before I leave. Representing the United States is more true now than any other time in my past. As David pointed out, it is the only U.S. ambassador who has cabinet rank. I believe that was a consolation prize given to Mr. Lodge, because he had been Mr. Nixon's running mate on the ticket which they lost to President Kennedy, and it has endured since. When I was given the job, there was some question of removing it, and I said I couldn't do that. I said, when I was deputy director or the acting director of CIA, I had either one person or nobody between me and the President of the United States. When I was asked to come as ambassador at large, which was the number 6, 7, 8 job in the State Department, I had no problem. It wasn't shrunk for me. But to ask me to go to the United Nations and obtain a massive bureaucratic and financial reform and send them a message, don't listen to this guy, he's not as important as whoever was here before, made my task impossible. So in the end, I did get that. And I have not used it for any personal advantage. I've had a number of differences with the Secretary of State. They've always been discussed privately. They've never made the newspapers. And I have won at least as many as I have lost. I am the only ambassador to the United Nations that I know who has ever said, I may be a cabinet officer, but in matters of foreign policy, I consider myself the subordinate of the Secretary of State. No nation, however rich or powerful, not even the United States, can afford 2 foreign policies. When I have differences with the department, we iron them out among ourselves. They never make the newspapers, which is a remarkable feat these days. I try and do all this verbally and not in writing, so there are no documents coming out of me to be reproduced with great triumph and skill. It is a fascinating job. I deal with 158 nations. My morning schedule may read like this. At 9 o'clock, the Fiji ambassador wants to see you. At 11, the Portuguese ambassador wants to see you. At 2, the ambassador of Rwanda, and at 4, the ambassador of Malaysia. And I've got to think, what do they all want? What have I got to be ready for? And it's the first job I've ever had where I feel I do not have enough time to inform myself as well as I would like to be informed. But I have an absolutely extraordinary staff, and they have been able up to now to supplement my empty spots and keep me out of major trouble. But it is a slightly uncomfortable feeling to think I don't have really enough time to prepare myself. And then, when I was appointed ambassador to the United Nations, I did not get a paper relieving me as ambassador at large. And I thought this was a bureaucratic oversight. Until they said to me, go and calm President Mobutu, he's furious. Go and tell the Europeans we're about to clobber Gaddafi. Go to Damascus and try and get the hostages out of Assad. I might say that on that, I was never authorized to offer him anything, but just ask him to help us get the hostages. And on one occasion he said to me, I think I know where they are, but they're in the hands of fanatics, and if I attack the building, they'll blow up the building and the hostages with them. Do you authorize me to do that? And needless to say, I had no such authority. Curiously, I was not asked to have any part in the Iran case, because, as you so accurately said, Frank, I think I would have given them the same kind of an answer. There are people who would like to talk to us, but they won't lift a finger until the Ayatollah is gone. Where were all these anti-Franco people during the month when he lay unconscious on a hospital bed? Nobody moved until he was certified dead by 3 doctors. Then everybody rose up and said, oh, I was against him the whole time. And this, unfortunately, is the situation in Iran. Right now, we've got a big problem of trying to stop that war. Now, I don't think the United States can play any real individual constructive role in that. The Iranian representative to the United States has already indicated that he regards me as a reincarnation of Satan. And the Security Council itself is a satanic organization. Of course, he was arrested the other day after stealing a raincoat. Now, we had watched him steal 2 suits earlier. 2 suits a little earlier. So, they asked me, do you want him declared persona non grata? And I said, no, he'll go home to a martyr's welcome. Here he has to live with the ridicule of his colleagues. Someone explained to me the reason why he did it is Alexander's is a Jewish department store, and he saw great merit to himself in stealing the raincoat. But only 4 delegates in representing the United States won't talk to me at the United Nations. My tactic on arriving was to nod to them once. If they didn't reply or acknowledge it, I would nod a second time. If they didn't reply, then to hell with them. 4 have never acknowledged either not. The North Koreans, which is to be expected. The Albanians, who regard us as fascists, just like the Russians and Chinese. The Libyans, who, when they staged that Berlin thing, I said to the Libyan just before we struck him, I said to him, whose dogs do you think we are that you can continue to kill us with impunity? Time and history are running out on you. They were. And the last one is, I talked to the Russians, I talked to the Nicaraguans, I talked to the Cubans, the Libyans, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and the Albanians. And those are the only 4. Master Reed here once was at a very formal dinner with the French ambassador, and the Albanian refused to shake hands with him, saying he was not shaking hands with fascists, which extends pretty far. It extends from Gorbachev to Reagan. That's a broad spectrum of fascists. It is an interesting thing to represent the United States in the United Nations. I have an absolutely superb team who supplement my own deficiencies. 2 of my ambassadors are Foreign Service officers, Pat Vernon, whom you may remember, Dave, from Paris, and Herb Oken, who is a truly extraordinary officer. He's bilingual in Russian. He understands more of the language, he understands their psychology, and so forth. And we have quite cordial personal relations with the Russians. Yes, I have seen a difference in their behavior since Gorbachev. The great problem with Gorbachev is we've had a number of false dawns with the Soviets before. You must remember that every Soviet leader since Stalin has died in his bed, except that reformer Khrushchev, who didn't die in his bed. He was expelled from power. The other day, the German foreign minister made a speech greatly praising Mr. Gorbachev. I can't think of a greater disservice you could do him. I mean, there's only one holy water in which you can drown easier than American holy water, and that's German holy water. And so when people ask me what I think is going on in the Soviet Union, I say I'm an optimist, but an optimist with prudence and vigilance. We've had other false dawns. We've had all this business of, oh, he loves American jazz and he drinks bourbon whiskey and all that sort of business. Mr. Gorbachev is saying that they've got to make the system work better. When Mr. Gorbachev says we've got to change the system, I will believe he is truly the master. The system has failed. They have had for 70 years control of the largest country in the world, 1/6 of the Earth's surface. They have 3 times as much farmland as we do. They have raw materials beyond our wildest dreams. And 70 years after the revolution, their gross national product is less than half the size of ours. So I think the intelligent ones realize something has got to change. But the resistance of the bureaucracy, the resistance of the party is enormous. He will require all the skill he needs to achieve his reformist goals, if that is indeed his purpose. Frankly, if I were a betting man, I'm a lot surer that Ronald Reagan will serve out his term as President of the United States than I am that Mr. Gorbachev will get to 1988 as Secretary General of the Central Committee. I hope he does. But we shall see. I've had, representing the United States, a difficult task of getting the Soviet delegation down from 275, that's 2.5 times the size of mine, down to something like the size of mine. And of course, when we do this, they retaliate against our embassy in Moscow. But they've got us. They've got 2 embassies in the United States, the one in Washington and the one in New York. We can only, so they can retaliate against us for whatever we do with either one of them, on either one of these. But they are coming down to it. We are explaining to them that there's an inherent right for every country to limit the size of the mission that is in that country. Otherwise, you could take over some small countries by sending in enough diplomats. And I believe the Italians once, during an election in San Marino, sent in enough carabinieri to swing the election. So that is a difficult bone of contention. But on matters of the reform of the United Nations, to bring about more budgetary responsibility, they were with us. They're the 3rd largest contributor. Japan has now passed them as the 2nd largest contributor. And really, in great part, we achieved this 15% reduction in overall staff, 25% reduction in the top level of employees, a reasonable budgetary process in which the large nations who contribute the overwhelming amount of money could make sure that there were no crazy projects that will totally unbalance the budget. The budget has now got to be adopted by consensus. And right now I am engaged in a huge battle to try and get from the Congress the United States assessed contribution which the United States signed and agreed to pay when George Bush was my predecessor. Last year, of our assessed contribution of $209, we paid $100 million. Now, I'm faced with that same situation again this year. It is very hard to explain to international organizations or to other countries that the United States is broke.